I like the Glicken text and the wide variety of topics that it covers and all the fields that it explores. And while it does address the issue of relationships with clients and some of the mechanics, I suppose is the term for it, as to how we go about establishing and maintaining relationships, it really doesn't go into a lot of detail about that and why those things are so important and how to go about not only establishing but maintaining a positive working relationship with clients. This book, I believe, fills in those gaps very effectively. I've used this book in earlier editions in another course that I've taught here at Kenai Peninsula College for the Human Services Department. And the book is written for social workers and human services workers and for any variety of individuals who are working in other fields that require one to establish positive therapeutic relationship with your clients. No matter what the nature of your work in social work, no matter what field you get into, whether you're in case management or whether you're in mental health services or you're providing child protection or working with substance abuse clients and so on, you're going to have to develop a relationship that is therapeutic in whatever way, in whatever form that takes in terms of the relationship that you develop with your client. I believe that this book is going to help you in terms of understanding how to go about doing that, and is a great introductory primer in terms of understanding what is engaged in establishing a helping relationship. In our society, we haven't really arrived at any kind of consensus about how we're going to go about dealing with our social problems. Human services workers and social workers who work with individuals who are clients of the various different social service programs in our society are exposed to philosophical differences, not only in terms of working with clients, but even in their own lives. And this is reflected in their attitudes towards themselves and towards their clients. The philosophy that is dominant in our society at any one time will determine such things as the resources that are available to workers, the funding that is available for the services that they're expected to provide, the expectations of those workers, and how they're to quote unquote help their clients, and also how those resources are used. As you know, the political landscape in the United States at the present time is certainly not leaning towards the provision of services, while the president may be left-leaning. Certainly the legislative bodies in Washington tend to lean more towards the right and towards a focus upon cutting back services. And so that has an impact on how we go about helping clients, not only in terms of what programs are available, but also in terms of the way we approach our clients, how long we can work with them, and in what type of role. But in any event, as the author of a textbook that I use in my social welfare class, Phyllis Day, will say, it's all about a pendulum swing in our attitudes in this nation, because we really can't pin down what we believe about helping others and what we believe about the nature of human beings. And so change in terms of what kind of services are out there is almost inevitable, and in fact really is the essence of living, as this slide implies. History, and that Day textbook I referred to earlier really is a history of social welfare services, and so it really does acknowledge that history is really a record of changes, and why it's important to understand these trends in our history is because we can become better able to understand what's going on today and why we have the attitudes and beliefs and values that we have, and so that can help us kind of form our own opinions and beliefs and values in the face of what may seem at times like very restrictive values and attitudes in our society. Altruism is that sense that we have that we want to do good. We just want to do good, and for no other reason than to do good. There is no personal gain in an altruistic attitude. It is all about the other, and altruism is at the core of many social work values and the social work profession as well, and it's certainly the motivation that brings many people into this field. Is that we want to, because you acknowledge that in the social work field, while you can get to a point where you're making a decent salary, nonetheless you're not coming into this because you want to get rich, because people understand that you don't really get wealthy working in the helping professions. You're doing this because you want to make an impact on other people's lives. You want to be able to feel good about what you've done, perhaps, and you want to bring about change. And so that's what altruism is about, and where that comes from, we really don't know. You see here that some scientists kind of connect it to, our going back to our infancy days or whatever it is. But whatever the reason, it's the root of the motivation of social work and social services. But it isn't necessarily characteristic of how those programs are applied. So, for instance, in the public welfare programs, ATAP, for an example, or food stamps, or now they're called the SNAP program. The basis of the reason for those, well, at least one of the basis for the existence of those programs, is to provide the basic necessities for individuals, sort of an altruistic kind of thing, to make sure that families have at least the bare essentials of what they need. And yet, how those programs are implemented in our nation tends to be one that's very controlling rather than supportive. And so, while the motivation underlying the program may be altruistic, the implementation of it is something other than that. And that's something that I think we should be very aware of as we go about our work. It's important for us to be aware of what's happening in our society, and that's one of the reasons why you will be keeping up a current events journal during the course of the semester, is because social workers need to be aware of what's happening in the world around them. And really, if there's one thing you gain from this course that might help you see things a little differently, I do hope that's at least one of those things. That there is an awareness that what goes on politically, what goes on socially, what goes on environmentally and economically, all of those things are very important to us and to our clients and our ability to help them. And so it is well worth our time to engage in the political discourse that's out there, and also to be aware of other kinds of changes that's going on. Part of that change process in history, of demographic changes, that our population is getting older, for instance, the spread of disease, changes in poverty and unemployment rates, war and peace, those kinds of things as well. We have a lot of history in terms of providing for those who are in need. It goes way back into very, very ancient times, even pre-Roman times. Really, the origins of the Judeo-Christian thinking is in being helpful to others, giving to others, and those kinds of things. And as time goes along, different things occur, create crises, and it brings about change. In our own American history, well, really dating back into European history, we have seen when the question comes about who's responsible for the needy, who are responsible for the needs of individuals, it had been for a long time, you must take care of yourself. And then with a lot of different economic changes that occurred, for instance, in Europe after the Protestant Reformation and the rise of capitalism that resulted from that, a lot of the individuals who who lived on feudal estates were really kind of just thrown out into the world because the feudal estates broke apart. And they had no skills and no ability to earn money, no position to be able to participate in the cash economy, and so they moved about from village to village and community to community, known as vagabonds, for instance, is one way they were referred to, and it became necessary for the communities who had very little resources to take care of the needy to define who they were going to help and who they weren't going to help. And well, the Elizabethan Poor Laws in the early 1600s in England, for instance, developed out of that need. And it specified who was responsible: first the individual, then the family if the individual couldn't care for himself or herself, and if there was no family or the family was unable to do so, then the local community, and only then. And then that depended upon whether or not you lived there. And communities actually had the capacity to be able to refuse admittance, refuse individuals from moving into the community if they weren't going to be able to produce and take care of themselves. over time, particularly in America and other places, the needs of the dispossessed became so great that the local community might not be able to take care of them, individual charities and churches and things like that, and so they began to look. Social welfare really began to become more of a regional or a state concern, and there were times beyond that when the needs of the population, say for instance after the Civil War, were so great for veterans, for instance, or for the freed slaves, that the federal government had to become involved in tending to providing programs for those individuals. Now, the current debate, and of course after the New Deal in the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government became involved in providing for the needy in a very big way, much more like what goes on in Europe all of the time and has gone on in Europe all of the time. But in any event, the big debate that often goes on in the halls of Congress and in our political discourse today is whether or not the federal government should be responsible for the needy, and or whether it should be a state concern. So you can see where some of this philosophy from this textbook really plays out in our present day. Our population trends, some of the changes we're talking about that are occurring at the present time, as I mentioned earlier, increase in the elderly population, also changes in the racial and ethnic makeup of the nation. These kinds of changes define the services that are going to be needed, where you may be working, and what you may be, what skills you may need to have when you're working, where you're working, and those things. For instance, there may be more of a need for bilingual workers, for instance, because of the influx of Latino population most recently. I mean, and previously there were other populations that moved to America that were also very, that came in large numbers and things like this. So this is a phase, more or less, of our nation's history and growth. But those changes in our history sometimes tell us what we need to learn and who we need to serve. And with this diversity that is increasing in the United States, it really has called a lot of us to question whether or not we truly are that melting pot, that the image that we have of ourselves is really a reality or not, because it seems very much as though we really don't want to take in others and make them our own. And for that matter, oftentimes those individuals who are immigrating to our nation also want to hold very much onto their own cultural histories and values for many very good reasons as well. So the basic changes that entail embracing diversity in our attitudes and behaviors and then have them reflect in our institutions don't come easily and really oftentimes create a lot of conflict. Today, you can see that in the debate about, for instance, about immigration and border protection and those kinds of things. And nowadays, we see stories coming about hate crimes in places where traditionally we have always considered to be safe, such as the schools, the universities, workplaces, churches, and so on. Another more recent development in terms of social services and individual needs in our society has been the HIV/AIDS epidemic. While this really developed about 30 years ago or 30 years or so ago, nonetheless this continues to be a major public health concern without a really good solution. Medications have developed now that help to slow the progression of the disease, but so that individuals that are diagnosed, for instance, with AIDS can live longer. There's still no cure for the disease, and the disease remains a burden, and it more so among the more oppressed populations and minority groups in our society, where access to health resources and other resources is necessary, income is limited, those kinds of things. So these kinds of problems always wind up being felt more deeply by minority populations. healthcare kind of springs from that, and with the changes in our healthcare programming in the last few years with the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, ACA as I refer to it here, or Obamacare is what people often refer to it as. Nonetheless, there's still a great need and a lot of people that are left uncovered. One of the reasons millions actually still have no health insurance even under the ACA. And one of the reasons why the ACA presents the problems it does, I believe at least, is because we still continue to rely upon private health insurers to be the providers of, for this insurance. And so the private insurance companies, even under a government program, are going to look for ways to make profit. That is what happens in a capitalistic society. And so why there's this big resistance to the single payer health insurance where the government would basically provide and manage the insurance program. This is what happens in most of the European nations, for instance, and other places where universal health care coverage exists. We resist that so much because we associate it in our heads with socialism. The socialized medicine, in fact, is another term for universal health care coverage. Socialized medicine may indeed be the thing that we need in order to get private insurance companies out of it, where the profit motive doesn't continue to inflate costs and expenses and things like this. But this is a part of our debate, and it's a debate that in the years ahead I hope that you will be involved in as professional social workers as we try to continue to move the society towards more equitable and more universal health care coverage. There's a lot of things you hear about wait times and quality of care and people abusing the system, and all of those kinds of things. Really, all of them are true on a person by person basis. You know, there are those stories that we have out there where this occurs that are true, but in the bigger picture, these are things that are thrown up by the status quo to keep things in place. There really aren't things that should stop us from moving forward. There are natural disasters and human-made disasters, these catastrophic events also, which bring devastation to us and really which can alter and change the course of a society and where its resources are being focused. Likewise, and I would include in the natural or rather human-made disasters, engagements in war around the nation, around the world. Now, it may be necessary to protect our interests, it may not be. That's all subject to debate, but one thing that we can be sure of is that resources that would otherwise be put towards the care of our elderly and our needy and our children and the disabled and the mentally ill, all those resources, well, not all of them, but a big portion of the money that might be used for that are being sent and put into artillery and military equipment and diplomacy and all of those types of things because of our engagement in those conflicts. And so there's a decision that is made in our nation when we go to war to divert our resources in that direction. And so when we have a war going on, what should we expect from the federal government as far as taking care of the needy, or should we expect the federal government to get out of that war as quickly and cleanly as possible? In times of natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina, for instance, or great tsunamis or earthquakes, what should we expect from governments in order to help us recover? These are questions that have to be answered from year to year. As we speak about war, of course, you know, we have the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout the Middle East that we've had to deal with over the past 10, 15 years. And veterans returning from current conflicts, you know, one of the things, there are fewer deaths in the war, say, than there was in previous wars because of the improvement in military equipment and perhaps military techniques. And yet, what we have, though, are a lot of people surviving, more veterans surviving with catastrophic losses, such as loss of limbs or head injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, those kinds of things. And so there are different kinds of concerns that have come up for veterans and their families now that our society must deal with. And you know, there were criticisms throughout 2013 and 14 about the Veterans Administration, for instance, and its its lack of responsiveness to veterans' needs, and it's very possible that the Veterans Administration just hasn't caught up with the times. That is still, maybe it's still operating on an old model, and it needs to catch up with what's really going on and what the needs of veterans are today. But in any event, many of the kinds of things that conditions that veterans come back with require long-term interventions and treatments, and will require the intervention of social workers. Likewise, veterans oftentimes experience homelessness, joblessness, the after effects of sexual assault, all those kinds of things as well, those issues of a social nature as well. And for the veterans in particular, as it is for anyone, but oftentimes for returning veterans, accessing services, that is saying you have a need, is something that, because of military training, may carry a stigma and make it very difficult for those individuals to actually pursue those services. Poverty and unemployment for veterans certainly, but also for Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, women, and children experience those groups experience the negative impacts of poverty and unemployment more than any others. Something to keep in mind when we talk about poor people is the largest percentage of poor people, the largest group who live in poverty are children. And we need to keep that in mind as we talk about poverty programs, because so often the focus is upon an unemployed parent. And that's just a small portion of a certain portion of those who are in need. And if you are poor and you're unemployed, you may very well lack adequate health insurance, which means you're going to have more health problems, which will create other problems for the individual, sometimes lasting their entire lives. What about a home ownership? For many people who live in poverty and who are unemployed, losing their homes, home ownership is an elusive dream. It's something that is unlikely to ever occur. And again, that's a part of that idea of the American dream, this idea that you have stable employment, you can own a home and have financial security if only you work hard enough. That just is something that isn't really true in reality. That the idea that if you just work hard, if you just try, if you just get out there and look for a job, you can succeed. This is not the case for a large portion of our population in America. So the services we provide they don't exist in a vacuum. They're going to bend, shape, and change depending upon the demands of society and of the demands of the time. They are a part of that changing social system, and really not only responds to the changes in our history, but also helps to shape some of those changes in history. And so the question for us is, how do we allow these changes to affect us and affect our ideas and attitudes about people and how we should deal with them? If the trends in thinking oppose the provision of social services, workers need to be aware of this and get engaged in the political process, in the social process to address this in a larger society. Don't just allow ourselves to sit back and say we'll provide help for the individuals when we're capable and when we're funded. But if there's inadequate funding, if there's inadequate staffing, if the needs are greater than the services or the resources that are being provided for us, we need to speak up and we need to challenge that, whether it be within our agency or within our community or with our legislators or with writing the White House, and not only in terms of how we cast our votes, but also in terms of how we communicate with those in power. Our social philosophies, our values determine how or if we're going to provide these services in the years ahead. And so engagement is an important part of the social work profession. So that pretty much ties up Chapter 1 in the Levine text. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll talk again next week.